Hey everyone, welcome to another video in my responsive design series. In this video, we're going to look back at some legacy layouts. Well, we're just going to look back at one legacy layout, and it's going to be the multi-column with floats and a clear. People still use this, but I'm calling it legacy because it's kind of dying. We've got a whole bunch of new technologies over the past few years, like Flexbox and Grid, and we'll look at that in a future unit. Those are going to replace this whole float and clear stuff. So right now, we're kind of reviewing things that you would have learned in the previous course if you took that from me. All right, so let's take a look at the markup that you need to start with. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, you need to go back and watch that because it's going to have all of this markup. I'm not going to slow down and pause so that you can copy all this down. You're just going to have to go back and watch that video. So let's get to it. We've got the standard template with the HTML doc type declaration. We've got our opening HTML tag, the language declared. We've got our head, as always. We've got something called the char set, the meta char set tag, which tells us what char set we're using. We're using UTF-8. We have our declaration that's going to tell us how it's going to handle content. And it's saying that the viewport is going to have a width of the device width, an initial scale of 1. We'll get more into this in future videos when we start talking more about responsive design. I have my title, and I've got a link to a style sheet. In the previous course, the Intro to Web Programming course, I usually did the style sheets right up in the head. In this course, for the most part, we're going to use linked style sheets. And then I've got my body. Like most websites I've showed you how to create, your body is going to have a header, nav, content, and footer. The header is going to have your H1 because each page needs an H1 that introduces the whole page. And then it's going to have H2s at the top of sections, and if those sections have subsections, they would have H3s and so on and so forth all the way down. That's the heading hierarchy you would have learned in Intro to Web Programming. I have a nav that has a UL, a series of LIs, and each LI is going to contain a link. I don't have any references in the href attribute because I don't have any other pages that I'm linking together. These are just placeholders right now. They'll get filled in at another point if I actually turn this into a 5-page website. I'm using the main tag for my main content, and that main tag is going to have a series of articles. In this case, I've got 3 articles. Each article is going to contain an H2 and 3 paragraphs. I've got my aside, which is for tangential content. It could be something like ads, or it could be links back to previous posts, or anything that's not like the main content that you're going to the website for. In there, I've got an article that has a series of paragraphs and an H2 at the top of the article. That's my aside. And then I've got a footer with a paragraph in it. So this is the markup that you need for this video. Once again, if you don't have it, you need to go back to the first video in this series, watch that video, copy the markup as you see it. All right, you've got this markup. So let's start digging in. In order to make this a multi-column web page, we need to use a style sheet. We need to style it. Right now, if I run this, go into my let's see, where are you? It's in here somewhere. Here we go. This is what the page looks like in a browser. It's not very special. It's all black text, white background. Everything just flows vertically. You can see I've got my header with my main. I've got my header with my headline. I've got my nav with my list and links. And then I've got my first article and second article, and then my footer. Let's go back to the markup. And let's start styling it. So like I said, we've got a link to an external style sheet. The links to an external style sheet looks like this. Link is the tag, not to be confused with the hyperlink, which is the A tag. The link tag links us to external resources. And I'm going to use the href attribute, which should contain a path to the file. I have my style sheet in the same folder as my HTML, so this is all I need for the path. I'm just going to reference the name, um, the file name directly. This is a relative link. You would learn this in the uh, intro to web programming class. And then the rel is going to be the type of file, and it's a style sheet. So I've got my style sheet right here. It's called style.css. Okay, you can see I'm linking it here. Here's my style sheet. Style sheet works just like CSS it did when we put it in the head. I select things. For example, I'm going to select header, and I'm going to give it a width of 80%. I'm going to give it a background color, and I'm going to make the background color sky blue, and I'm going to leave it at that. I'll save this, and then when I refresh it in the browser, you can see that it is now 80% width, everything else is 100%, and it's got a sky blue background. Okay? I'm going to do some of the same stuff with the nav and the footer. So nav and footer are going to have the same thing. If I want to do that, I can just make a comma separated list. You can make a comma separated list of selectors that are all going to have the same rule applied to it. So if I want the nav, header, and footer to look the same, that's what I'm going to do. Make a comma separated list, and now they all have width of 80% and background of sky blue. Save it, refresh it, and you can see the nav lines up, and then the footer lines up. Okay? Now what I want to do is make the main and the aside work as columns. If you think back to intro to web programming, to make them columns, I have to give them a set width, and that width should add up to nothing more than 100%. Okay? And then we need to float them left. So let's do that. I'm going to go main and aside and create their rules. I want them to be a 50-50 split. I both want them to be the same width. Now, I could go width 50% and width 50%. Save it, check it in the browser, and see if they shrunk down. And they do. You can see they're both 50% width of the entire browser. And then I'm going to float them left. Float it left. Save it, check it. Now they should be two columns, which they are, but something looks really weird here. The footer is sitting right there, right below the left column, and the footer looks like it's going all the way up to the top. So if you think back to when we talked about using floats, I said that floats will take the things that are floated out of the flow of the content, and everything wants to flow around it. So the footer is trying to flow to the right side of the things that are floated left. And this is as high up as it can go. But its box goes all the way up to underneath the nav. So what we have to do to fix that is we have to clear the footer. When I did this in a previous video, I did something like this, .clearfix. And I go clear both so that nothing can sit to the left and right side of it. And then I'm going to apply the clearfix class to my footer. So I'll go over to the footer, and I'll go footer class equals clearfix without the little dot in front of it. Now let's talk about classes as a quick review. A class is a special kind of style rule that you can apply to any elements within the markup. So I could apply the clearfix to the article, to the aside, to the main, to whatever I want. And I can use it over and over and over again. We make these classes for standard types of rules that we're going to continue to use. In this case, I'm just using it on the footer to clear out the footer so it can't sit float along the right side of the things that are floated left. I will save this, and I'll check it in the browser and see if the footer decides to behave. Whoops, I just closed it. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to refresh it. There we go. Now it's refreshed, and you can see that the footer is no longer sitting under this right column. It's down where it belongs. Right, now things don't quite look the way I want them to look. Those two columns are too wide. Notice they're taking up 100% the width of the browser instead of being in line with the header, nav, and footer. And everything is kind of touching the edges of its boxes. You may remember from previous videos that I really hate it when you've got content that's touching the edge of boxes. We usually want to have some spacing between the content and the edge of the box. We'll look at that in just a minute. But what I want to do first is I want to make sure that the whole entire page is only going to be 80% the width of the browser. Well, I'm putting up two fingers like there are only two ways of doing this. There are a lot of ways you can do this. There are so many ways to achieve the types of designs you want in HTML. There's no one way to do it, but I'm going to show you two different ways. I'm going to show you constraining the widths of those two columns so that they only add up to 80% total. And then I'm going to show you by creating a little bit more HTML and creating a wrapper that's going to wrap up the entire page. And we'll constrain the width of the entire page to 80% using the wrapper. So first, let's make those columns that total 80% width. All right, so I'll go to my style, and my two columns are my main and my aside. So instead of being 50 and 50% width, if I want them to add up to the 80, I want them to be 40% width and 40% width. So I'll save it. I'll check it in the browser. And there we go. Now everything lines up vertically really nicely. Cool. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, we can add a little bit of extra HTML architecture to the page. So let's go to our HTML markup. And then above the header, but inside the body, I'm going to make a div. And I'm going to call it class wrapper. And then I'm going to close this div all the way down below my footer. So I want it to wrap up all of my content from above the header to below the footer. And I'm going to put a little comment down here because it's so disconnected from its opening. Just say close wrapper div. Anytime you have tags where the opening and closing tag are so far apart, it doesn't hurt to put a little comment next to the closing tag to indicate what that is for, especially if you have a lot of nested divs, which we may see in future videos. Just get in the habit of putting those comments next to the closing tag, just to help yourself with debugging or to help people that support this web page later on down the road. All right, so I've got that wrapper in there. And now, because it is a class, it's div class wrapper, I need to make a class style rule in the style sheet. So I'm going to put this right down here. I'll go dot wrapper because the dot operator indicates that it is a class. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a width. And I said that I wanted the width of my whole web page to be 80%. So I'll go 80% on the width. I'll save it. I'll check it in the browser. And now everything takes up 80%. Really? Is that 80%? It doesn't look like it. It looks a bit smaller than 80%. And let's think about why. If we look at our CSS, we've got the header, the nav, and the footer set to 80%. We've got the main and the aside set to 40 and 40, which adds up to 80%. So these things right here are taking up 80% of their container. If we look at the markup, the container for all of that is the wrapper. The wrapper is taking up 80% of its container, which is the body. The body is 100% of the browser width right now. So our wrapper is taking up 80% of the body, and then this header, nav, is taking up 80% of the wrapper. So this is 80% of this 80%. I don't want that. I want the header and the nav and the aside and the main and the footer to take up 100% of the wrapper. And I'm going to let the wrapper constrain the overall width of the page. So as the wrapper gets wider and narrower, everything in the page will get wider and narrower. So let's go to the CSS and fix that. And to do that, we can just take the width off of this. I can change this to 50% and this to 50%. And now, aside and main, 50% and 50% add up to 100. Header, nav, and footer don't have a width applied, so that means that they have the default width of 100%. And the wrapper is constraining the whole page at 80%. There we go. That looks like it's about 80%. All right, let's talk about some of the other things that you are going to do in a legacy layout. One of the things we have to do when we're doing this legacy layout is we have to start thinking about white space. Like I said before, there's no white space in our layout. Our content is touching the edge of the boxes. The content on the right column is touching the content on the left column. I can't stand that. It makes it really difficult to read this design. So we need to do some things. We need to add white space in there. We do that with things like margin and padding. Once again, there are millions of ways to create the design that you desire. Oftentimes, what I would recommend is to push content away from the edges of its boxes. You use padding. So in this case, I'm going to give some padding on the main and the aside, the header, the nav, and the footer. So header, nav, and footer should all have something that's consistent. So I'll give it padding of, let's just start with 2%. We can figure out what really is going to look good later. Okay? And I'm going to do that same padding on the main and the aside. So I'll save it, I'll check it in the browser, and it should look good. Can anybody anticipate a problem that may arise from this before I refresh it? If you remember back to the previous videos in the Intro to Web Programming series, you would remember that when you float columns, you do float left and float left, the widths of the boxes have to add up to 100%. And the sum total width of a box is the margins, padding, width, and border all added up together. And if those ever exceed 100% for your floated columns, then they're no longer columns, they stack vertically. So right now, the width of my aside and my main add up to 2% right there on the left, 2% on the right, so that's 4% total, plus 50%. So that's 54% for this column, and 54% width for this column. So right now it's a total of 108% width. We need to have this only add up to 100% total. So here's the general rule of thumb. Remember this from previous videos when we did these legacy layouts, is that the sum total here of our widths and paddings for both of our columns have to be 100. So if I'm adding 2% to the left and 2% to the right on my main, that's an extra 4%. I have to take that 4% away from somewhere, so I'll take it away from the width. So 50 minus 4 is 46, so that'll be 46%. I have to do the same thing with the aside. So I'll go to 46% there as well. Okay, save it, and when I check it in the browser, everything should be fixed. It should now be two columns sitting side by side. And there you go. Now I've got a little bit of white space in my layout. I've got my two columns, and then I've got my wrapper constraining the width of the whole thing. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the whole thing float in the middle of the page. I shouldn't use the term float because that implies using the float property. I'm going to make it sit in the middle of the page. And I'm going to do that with my wrapper. If you think back to the legacy layouts that we talked about in Intro to Web Programming, I used margins to do that. I went margin, and then I set it to 0, auto. That means that the top and bottom have 0 margin, and the left and right are auto. Auto means it'll automatically set the margins on the left and right side to be equal, thereby floating that thing in the middle. And there we have it, our basic legacy layout. This is not a nice looking web page right now. I didn't do anything to really design it except for add some white space in. If you were to work with this as a template, then you need to do things like change fonts, change font sizes, do all your typography stuff, add images in there, add more backgrounds in there. You would want to play around with the navigation to make it look better. There are all kinds of things that you would do. You learned all those things in Intro to Web Programming. But this will get you off on the right start to dig into the responsive design topics. Now, after this unit, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into Flexbox and Grid. And we're going to throw away the legacy layout. We're not going to use floats anymore to create columns. The only thing you'll ever use float for is to have content go in line in the flow of the document and have content flow around it. Use it as it was intended. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.